My son tossed my bags into the street. He didn't know I already sold his condo. The rain soaked through my thin coat as I watched 20 years of memories scatter across the wet pavement. I never imagined it would come to this. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Eleanor, and I'm 73 years old. I sit here in my small Queens apartment, the radiator hissing its familiar tune, looking out at the gray December sky that mirrors how I felt for so many years. The scent of Earl Grey tea mingles with the faint smell of old wood and the ghost of my late husband's aftershave that still clings to his favorite armchair. I never moved it. Even after 5 years, I couldn't bring myself to let go of that last piece of him. That morning started like any other. I woke at 5:30, my arthritis making my fingers curl like claws before I could stretch them back to life. The floorboards creaked their familiar song as I shuffled to the kitchen, my worn slippers whispering against the linoleum. I prepared my breakfast, instant oatmeal with a touch of honey, the same meal I'd eaten for 3 years straight because it was all I could afford after helping Michael with his mortgage payments month after month. Michael, my only son. The boy who once ran into my arms after school, his face bright with stories and scraped knees that needed kissing. Now 45, married to Jennifer, father to my grandson Tommy. When did his warm brown eyes turn so cold? When did his voice lose that note of affection when he said, "Mom"? I remember the exact moment everything changed. It was a Tuesday in October. The leaves were turning gold and crimson outside my window, and I was sorting through old photographs when my phone rang. Michael's voice came through sharp and impatient. "Mom, I need to talk to you. I'm coming over." No, "How are you feeling?" No, "Is this a good time?" Just that familiar tone that meant he needed something. Again. I put on my good dress, the navy blue one with tiny flowers that Harold had bought me for our anniversary years ago. I brushed my silver hair and even put on lipstick. Foolish me, thinking this might be a social visit. Maybe he wanted to bring Tommy by to see his grandmother. Maybe Jennifer had finally warmed up to me. The knock came at 2 o'clock, sharp, impatient. I opened the door with a smile that died on my lips when I saw his face. Michael stood there in his expensive suit, the one I'd helped pay for when he started his job at the consulting firm. His jaw was set, his eyes avoiding mine. "We need to pack your things," he said without stepping inside. "You can't stay here anymore." The words hit me like a physical blow. I gripped the doorframe, feeling the world tilt beneath my feet. "What do you mean? This is my home." "Not anymore. I can't keep paying for this place. You're going to have to find somewhere else." I stared at him, this stranger wearing my son's face. "Michael, what are you saying? I don't understand." "The rent, Mom. I can't cover it anymore. Business is tough. Jennifer's pregnant again, and we need every penny for the new baby." Pregnant again. The first I was hearing of it. No phone call to share the happy news. No invitation to celebrate. Just this brutal eviction disguised as financial necessity. "But where will I go? I've been here for 15 years. This is where your father—" "That's not my problem." His voice cut through my words like broken glass. "You've got until the end of the week." He turned to leave, then stopped. "Oh, and Mom? Don't make this harder than it has to be. Just pack light." The door closed with a soft click that echoed like thunder in my chest. I stood there for what felt like hours, my hand still on the doorknob, trying to process what had just happened. My son, my only child, had just made me homeless with the casual indifference of someone canceling a magazine subscription. That's when I noticed the boxes he'd left by my door. Moving boxes. He'd come prepared for my eviction. I want you to understand something about sacrifice. About love that flows one way for so long you forget it's supposed to be a circle, not a straight line that ends in emptiness. For 25 years, I've been Michael's safety net, his emergency fund, his unpaid therapist and babysitter and house cleaner and cook. When he was 22 and fresh out of college, I co-signed his first apartment lease when no one else would take a chance on him. When he was 24 and lost his job, I let him move back home for 8 months without asking for a penny in rent. When he was 28 and wanted to propose to Jennifer, I gave him my grandmother's engagement ring, a 2-carat diamond that had been in our family for 3 generations. Just until I can afford to buy her something better, he'd promised. I'm still waiting for that ring's return. When Tommy was born, I quit my part-time job at the library to help with childcare. Jennifer had complications after the delivery, and someone needed to be there. Michael couldn't take time off work. He was trying to make partner at his firm. So Grandma Eleanor stepped in, as always. I changed diapers, did midnight feedings, walked the floors with a colicky baby while Jennifer recovered and Michael climbed his corporate ladder. "We couldn't have done it without you, Mom," he'd said then, exhaustion making his voice soft with gratitude. That was 7 years ago. What happened to that gratitude? The requests for money started small. 100 here, 200 there. "Just until payday, Mom. I'll pay you back." But payday came and went, and the money disappeared into their life like water into sand. The down payment for their house, $15,000 from my retirement fund. The new car when Jennifer's Honda died, another $8,000. Tommy's private school tuition when the public school wasn't good enough, $3,000 a semester. "You want the best for your grandson, don't you, Mom?" That's how they phrased it. Not as a favor, not as a generous gift from a grandmother's love, but as an obligation. As if denying them would make me a selfish old woman who didn't care about her family's future. And I paid. Every time, I paid. Even when it meant eating generic cereal for breakfast and skipping my heart medication because I couldn't afford both the pills and Tommy's soccer camp fees in the same month. Do you know what it feels like to choose between your own health and your grandchild's happiness? To sit in your doctor's office and lie about why you didn't fill your prescription? To smile and nod when the nurse asks if you're taking care of yourself, knowing you're slowly dying from the inside out because love has become a currency you can't afford to stop spending? The quiet moments were the worst. The times between crises when I'd sit in my apartment and wait for the phone to ring, knowing it would only ring when they needed something. Birthdays passed without acknowledgement. My birthday, Harold's death anniversary, our wedding anniversary. Dates that once mattered reduced to ordinary Tuesdays and Thursdays because the people who should remember were too busy living their lives to remember mine. Last Christmas, I spent 17 hours cooking for their family dinner. Turkey with all the fixings, 3 desserts, Harold's famous stuffing recipe that took me 2 days to prepare. I set the table with my good china, the set my mother had given me as a wedding gift. I even bought new Christmas decorations because Jennifer had mentioned once that my old ones looked dated. They arrived an hour late. Jennifer barely glanced at the food before announcing they could only stay for an hour because they had another party to attend. Michael spent the entire meal on his phone, responding to work emails. Tommy asked if they could leave early because he was bored. I watched them eat my food, barely tasting it, checking their watches, eager to be anywhere but at their mother and grandmother's table. When they left, there were still 3/4 of the turkey untouched, pies barely cut, love unrecognized and unreturned. I cleaned up alone, wrapping enough leftovers for a week, wondering when Christmas dinner with family had become such a burden for everyone except me. That night, I found myself crying over the dishes, and I couldn't even explain why. The tears just came, hot and bitter, mixing with the dishwater like liquid loneliness. But the moment that broke something inside me happened 3 months ago. I had a heart episode, not a full attack, but enough to scare me into taking an ambulance to the hospital. The paramedics found me on my kitchen floor, clutching my chest, my vision blurry with pain and fear. In the emergency room, alone and frightened, I called Michael. "Mom, this really isn't a good time. Jennifer and I are at Tommy's school play. Can this wait?" "I'm in the hospital, Michael. I think I had a heart attack." A pause. Not shock, not concern, but irritation. "Are you sure? You've always been dramatic about medical stuff. Remember when you thought you had pneumonia but it was just a cold?" "Please," I whispered, feeling smaller than I'd ever felt in my entire life. "I'm scared. Look, I'll try to stop by tomorrow if I can. But you're probably fine. These things usually aren't as serious as they seem." He hung up. My son hung up while I was lying in a hospital bed, electrodes attached to my chest, wondering if I was going to die alone in a sterile room that smelled of disinfectant and other people's fear. The nurse, Maria, saw my face and sat down beside me. "Family?" she asked gently. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Sometimes the people who should love us most are the ones who hurt us deepest," she said, adjusting my blanket with hands that radiated the kindness my own son couldn't spare. "But you're not alone. Not here." I spent the night in observation. Michael never came. Jennifer never called. Only Tommy sent a text the next day. "Grandma Eleanor, are you okay? Dad said you were in the hospital, but you're probably fine." Probably fine. Those words echoed in my mind during the long subway ride home, still wearing the same clothes I'd collapsed in, my chest sore from the tests, and my heart sorer from the indifference. That's when I started to plan. Quietly, carefully, like a woman who'd finally learned that love without respect is just another form of abuse. I made appointments I'd been putting off for years. I called lawyers, accountants, real estate agents. I started asking questions about my finances, my rights, my options. And I discovered something that made everything clear. The condo where Michael lived, the beautiful 2-bedroom place overlooking Central Park that he'd always told me he was renting, he didn't own it. I did. When he'd asked me to co-sign the lease 5 years ago, what he'd actually had me sign was a purchasing agreement. My name was on the deed. My credit score had secured the mortgage. My retirement fund had paid the down payment. But the monthly mortgage payments I'd been sending to help him with rent were going into his personal account. He'd been collecting my money while the actual mortgage payments fell behind. The condo was 3 months away from foreclosure, and as the legal owner, I was the one who would face the consequences. My son hadn't just been taking my money. He'd been stealing it while putting my financial future at risk. The scope of his deception took my breath away. This wasn't just neglect or thoughtlessness. This was calculated betrayal. Have you ever had a moment when your entire understanding of your life shifted? When everything you believed about the people you loved most revealed itself to be a carefully constructed lie? That's what I felt sitting in that lawyer's office, looking at documents that proved my own son had been systematically destroying me while I thanked him for the privilege. The lawyer, Mrs. Chen, looked at me with a mixture of professional sympathy and barely concealed anger. "Mrs. Robinson, you understand what this means? You own this property. He's been essentially stealing from you while letting you believe you were helping him pay rent." I nodded, my hands shaking as I signed the papers that would transfer the utilities back into my name, that would give me full legal authority over the property that had always been mine. "What do you want to do?" she asked. I looked at her, this stranger who was showing me more respect and consideration than my own family had in years, and I told her my plan. The eviction notice was delivered on a Thursday morning. Professional, legal, and final. Michael had 30 days to vacate the premises or face legal action. The papers were served by a bailiff who knew nothing about our family drama, who saw only what it was. A property owner reclaiming their home from a tenant who had failed to pay. My phone rang within an hour. "What the hell is this, Mom? Some kind of joke?" His voice was different now. Not the careless dismissal I'd grown accustomed to, but genuine shock tinged with something I'd never heard from him before. fear. It's not a joke, Michael. It's my home. It's always been my home. You can't do this. We have a lease. No, you don't. Check your paperwork. You'll find that I'm the legal owner, and you've been living there rent-free while telling me you were paying rent. Where has my money been going, Michael? Silence. Long, telling silence. You don't understand the situation, Mom. This is more complicated than you think. Then explain it to me. Explain how taking my money while letting my property go into foreclosure is complicated. Explain how lying to me for 5 years is complicated. Look, we can work this out. Jennifer's pregnant and we can't just move. Be reasonable. Reasonable? After 25 years of being nothing but reasonable, of being understanding, accommodating, endlessly forgiving, I was finally being unreasonable. And it felt like breathing after holding my breath my entire adult life. But Michael wasn't going to accept defeat quietly. The next morning, I woke to find my belongings scattered across the sidewalk in front of the condo building. My clothes, my books, the small box of photographs I'd been keeping in the guest room closet, everything thrown out like garbage, soaked from the overnight rain. Neighbors stood in their doorways, watching this public humiliation, this final act of disrespect from a son who had already taken everything else. Mrs. Patterson from 4B helped me gather what could be salvaged. Mr. Kowalski offered to call the police. I thanked them both but shook my head. This wasn't about getting justice anymore. This was about getting free. I stood there on the wet sidewalk, holding a dripping photo of Harold and me on our honeymoon, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Clarity. Pure, crystalline understanding of exactly who I was dealing with and exactly what I needed to do. Michael appeared in the doorway above, leaning over the balcony like some twisted Romeo addressing his discarded Juliet. There, he called down. Now you can find somewhere else to dump your stuff. I hope you're happy. I looked up at him, this man I'd raised, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, whose nightmares I'd chased away, whose dreams I'd funded with my own sacrifice, and I felt nothing but pity. Not for myself, but for him, for the person he'd chosen to become. I already have somewhere else, I called back, my voice carrying in the morning air. But you don't. I watched his face change as understanding dawned. The confidence melted away, replaced by something approaching panic. What do you mean? I smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd worn in months. Check your mail, Michael. The eviction notice should have arrived by now. The sound he made, part gasp, part denial, was the sweetest music I'd heard in years. Not because I wanted him to suffer, but because I finally had the power to stop my own suffering. But this story doesn't end with revenge. It ends with something much more powerful. Rebirth. The family meeting happened a week later, in the law office Mrs. Chen had recommended. Michael arrived with Jennifer, both of them looking like people who'd been sleepwalking through life and suddenly found themselves awake in a courtroom. Tommy stayed with his other grandmother, the one who, I'd learned, had been told I was a difficult, demanding woman who expected too much from her hard-working son. Mom, you're being unreasonable, Jennifer started before the lawyer even sat down. We're family. Family doesn't do this to each other. I looked at her, really looked at her for perhaps the first time in 7 years of knowing her. Jennifer was beautiful in that polished, expensive way that money can buy. Her hair was professionally colored, her nails perfectly manicured, her handbag worth more than I spent on groceries in 3 months. This woman who had never worked while I supported her lifestyle was telling me about family obligations. You're right, I said quietly. Family doesn't do this to each other. So why have you been doing it to me? Michael jumped in, his voice carrying that old note of assumed authority. Mom, you're confused about the financial arrangements. I've been paying rent. To yourself, Mrs. Chen interrupted, sliding a bank statement across the table. Mrs. Robinson's payments have been going into your personal account while the actual mortgage went unpaid. That's fraud, Mr. Robinson. Your mother could file criminal charges if she chose to. The color drained from Michael's face. Jennifer looked between the lawyer and her husband like someone trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Michael, she said slowly, you told me your mother owned the condo and was letting us live there as a gift. Another lie. Another layer of deception. I watched my son's carefully constructed world begin to crumble, built as it was on a foundation of manipulation and stolen money. It's not that simple, he stammered. Mom wanted to help. She insisted on helping. I wanted to help my family, I said, my voice steady. I didn't want to be systematically robbed while being made to feel grateful for the privilege. That's when Jennifer surprised me. Instead of defending her husband, she turned to him with something approaching horror in her eyes. You've been taking money from your mother? Your elderly mother? While I thought she was being generous? It's not like that. She has savings. She doesn't need... I eat generic cereal for breakfast because helping you meant I couldn't afford name brand, I interrupted. I haven't bought new clothes in 3 years because your mortgage came first. I've been skipping doctor's appointments because your car payments were more important than my medication. The silence in that room was deafening. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the distant sound of traffic, the quiet scratch of Mrs. Chen's pen taking notes. But from my family, nothing but stunned silence. I want the condo sold, I continued. I want my money returned, every penny you've taken under false pretenses. And I want you to stop treating me like an ATM that occasionally needs to be fed and watered. And if we refuse? Michael's voice was barely a whisper. Mrs. Chen answered for me. Then Mrs. Robinson will pursue both civil and criminal charges for fraud, theft, and financial elder abuse. The district attorney's office takes these cases very seriously. I watched my son absorb this information, saw him realize that his elderly, accommodating mother had finally learned to bite back. The look on his face might have broken my heart once. Now it just confirmed what I already knew. He'd never seen me as a person deserving of basic respect. Fine, he said finally. Fine, we'll move out. We'll pay you back. But don't expect things to go back to normal between us. Normal? I laughed, and it felt good to laugh again, even in that sterile office. Michael, normal was you treating me like a combination bank and servant while I pretended to be grateful. If that's what we're losing, then I'd say we're all better off. But the universe wasn't done testing me. 3 days after the family meeting, as I was finally starting to feel like I'd reclaimed some control over my life, Michael played his final card. He posted on Facebook. A long, rambling post about ungrateful elderly parents who turn on their families after a lifetime of love and support. He painted himself as the devoted son who'd sacrificed to care for his demanding mother, only to be repaid with legal threats and eviction notices. He tagged relatives, family friends, neighbors, anyone who might read his version and believe it. The comments were brutal. People I'd known for years, people who'd eaten at my Christmas table, suddenly saw me as a bitter old woman who'd turned against her loving family out of spite or mental decline. Cousins who hadn't spoken to me in months suddenly had strong opinions about my character. Church members I'd served alongside for decades shared the post with their own commentary about ungrateful parents who didn't appreciate their children's sacrifices. My phone started ringing, not with concern, but with judgment. "Eleanor, what's gotten into you?" my sister called from Florida. "Michael's always been such a good son." "Maybe you should see someone about this behavior," suggested my neighbor, Mrs. Williams. "Sometimes seniors get confused about money matters." The narrative Michael had crafted was perfect. The devoted son overwhelmed by caring for an unreasonable mother who'd finally lost perspective. No mention of the fraud, the lies, the systematic financial abuse. Just a simple story of family dysfunction that cast him as the victim and me as the villain. For 48 hours, I felt the weight of their judgment. I wondered if they were right. If I was being unreasonable, vindictive, confused. The old me would have called Michael, apologized, begged for forgiveness, and gone back to being the ATM with a heartbeat. But then I remembered something Harold used to say. Eleanor, the truth doesn't stop being true just because people choose not to believe it. So I wrote my own post. Not long, not rambling, just simple and clear. For those who've seen the recent post about my family situation, I want you to know that my son has been living in a condo I own while telling me he was paying rent. The money I've been sending to help with rent has been going into his personal account, while the actual mortgage went unpaid, putting my home at risk of foreclosure. This isn't about being ungrateful. This is about refusing to be financially abused any longer. I'm sharing this not to hurt anyone, but because I've learned that staying silent about mistreatment only enables it to continue. I attached the bank statements showing Michael's deception, the mortgage documents proving my ownership, the legal papers documenting the unpaid loans. I tagged the same people he had, the same relatives and friends who'd been so quick to judge. The response was swift and decisive. The comments on Michael's post shifted. People started asking questions he couldn't answer. The narrative of the devoted son caring for a difficult mother crumbled under the weight of documented evidence. But more importantly for me, I stopped caring about their opinions entirely. The truth was out there, available to anyone who wanted to see it. Those who chose to believe Michael's lies over documented evidence weren't people whose judgment I needed to value. That was the moment of my real transformation. Not when I filed the eviction papers or hired the lawyer, but when I stopped needing people to understand my choices in order to feel good about making them. The move-out happened on a Tuesday. I hired professional movers to handle my belongings. No more tossing bags onto wet sidewalks. I had my things moved not to another cramped apartment, but to the condo that had always been mine. After years of paying the mortgage on a home where I wasn't welcome, I was finally going to live in it. Michael and Jennifer were there when I arrived with my small collection of belongings. They'd packed their things efficiently, professionally, like people fleeing a crime scene. Which, I suppose, they were. The keys, Mrs. Chen said simply, extending her hand. Michael placed them in her palm without looking at me. Jennifer carried a box to their car, her face carefully blank. Tommy, sweet Tommy, stood in the doorway looking confused and sad. Grandma Eleanor, he said quietly, are you mad at us? I knelt down to his level, ignoring the pain in my arthritis-ridden knees, and looked into his innocent 7-year-old eyes. I'm not mad, sweetheart. I'm just learning to take care of myself better. Will I get to see you still? I glanced at Michael, who was pointedly not listening to this conversation, then back at Tommy. I'll always love you, Tommy. But I won't be able to help with things like soccer camp and school fees anymore. That's going to be between you and your parents. The boy nodded solemnly, like he understood more than any child should have to. He hugged me then, a fierce, desperate hug that made me wonder what version of this story he'd been told. I love you, Grandma Eleanor. I love you too, sweet boy, so very much. And then they were gone. 25 years of mothering, supporting, enabling, and sacrificing walked out of my life and climbed into a Honda Civic loaded with possessions I'd helped them gather. I stood in the doorway of my home, my actual home, and felt something I hadn't experienced since Harold died. Complete quiet. Not the lonely quiet of abandonment, but the peaceful quiet of solitude chosen rather than imposed. The condo was beautiful. 2 bedrooms, hardwood floors, large windows that let in streams of afternoon sunlight, modern kitchen appliances, a bathroom with a deep tub perfect for soaking arthritic joints, a balcony that overlooked a small park where children played and couples walked dogs. This was what my money had been buying all these years, this comfort, this space, this peace. I'd been paying for it while living in a cramped Queens apartment, believing I was making a sacrifice for my family's future while they lived in the luxury my labor had purchased. I made tea that first afternoon. Real tea, loose-leaf Earl Grey that I'd been saving for special occasions. I sat on the balcony with my cup, watching the city move below me, and tried to remember the last time I'd felt truly relaxed. The answer was troubling. I couldn't remember. For 25 years, I'd been in a constant state of low-level anxiety about money, about whether I was doing enough, giving enough, being enough for the people I loved. Even in my moments of rest, there'd been an undercurrent of worry about the next request, the next crisis, the next way I'd need to shrink myself to make room for someone else's needs. Now, sitting in my own space, surrounded by silence that belonged to me, brewing tea that I didn't have to share, I felt my shoulders drop away from my ears for the first time in decades. But the real rebirth started the next morning, when I woke up in my own bed and realized I had nowhere to be, no one to take care of, nothing to do but figure out what I wanted to do. I started small. I walked to the park and sat on a bench, feeding pigeons with breadcrumbs from the good bakery I'd always walked past, but never entered because their prices were too high for someone supporting 3 households. I bought myself a novel, a real book, brand new, with crisp pages and an uncracked spine, and read it in one sitting, lost in someone else's story instead of endlessly reliving my own disappointments. I bought groceries without calculating every purchase against someone else's needs. Name-brand peanut butter, fresh flowers, a bottle of wine that cost more than I used to spend on a week's worth of meals. Not because I'd suddenly become wealthy, but because I'd finally stopped funding someone else's lifestyle at the expense of my own basic comfort. The nights were the hardest. Dinner for one, television shows chosen without compromise, bedtime whenever I felt tired instead of after everyone else had been taken care of. The freedom was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. I called my sister in Florida, the one who'd questioned my judgment after reading Michael's Facebook post. "Eleanor, how are you holding up?" "I'm doing well, Linda. Better than I have in years. I have to admit, after I saw those bank papers you posted, I had no idea Michael had been, well, taking advantage like that. I didn't want you to know. I didn't want anyone to know. I was embarrassed that I'd let it go on for so long. You were being a mother, a grandmother. There's no shame in wanting to help family. There's no shame in stopping when help becomes harm either." We talked for an hour, the longest conversation we'd had since Harold's funeral. Linda told me about her life in retirement, her volunteer work, her book club, her garden. Normal things that normal people did when they weren't being slowly drained by people who confused love with exploitation. "You know what you should do?" she said as we were winding down. "You should travel. Remember how you and Harold always talked about seeing Ireland?" Ireland. We'd planned that trip for our retirement before the cancer took Harold and Michael's needs took my savings. The idea seemed impossible and essential at the same time. I couldn't. The expense. "Eleanor, you own a condo in Manhattan. You've got more financial security than you've had in years. And besides, when was the last time you did something just because you wanted to?" I couldn't answer, because I couldn't remember. That conversation planted a seed that grew over the following weeks. I started researching flights, hotels, guided tours. I printed out photographs of stone cottages in green hills, imagining myself walking paths Harold and I had dreamed about together. But first, I needed to rebuild the parts of myself that had been buried under years of service to people who took that service for granted. I enrolled in a pottery class at the community center. My hands, twisted with arthritis and shaky from years of stress, seemed to remember a grace I'd forgotten I possessed as they shaped clay into bowls and cups and small sculptures that looked like abstract versions of joy. You have a natural talent for this, said Marcus, the instructor, a gentleman in his 50s who treated creativity like prayer. I used to paint, I told him, surprised by the memory. Before Michael was born. Landscapes, mostly. I had a studio set up in our basement. What happened to your paintings? I gave up the space when Michael needed a playroom, stored the canvases in the attic. I paused, my hands stilling on the clay. I never went back to them. Maybe it's time. That weekend, I took the train to Queens and let myself into my old apartment, which I was still paying rent on until the lease expired. Everything looked smaller, darker, more cramped than I remembered. The air felt stale with old disappointment. I climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, something I hadn't done in 15 years. In the corner, wrapped in old sheets, I found them. 37 paintings of landscapes, flowers, abstracts inspired by music and poetry. Some were amateur work, the efforts of a young woman teaching herself technique through library books and magazine articles. But others were good. Really good. I stood in that dusty attic, holding a painting of a sunset over the Hudson River, and remembered the woman who'd created it. She'd been hopeful, ambitious, creative. She'd dreamed of art shows and gallery walls. She'd painted not because anyone asked her to, but because beauty demanded expression, and she had hands capable of giving it form. What had happened to her? I knew the answer. She'd been buried under years of being needed in ways that had nothing to do with who she was, and everything to do with what she could provide. Layer by layer, like sediment covering a fossil, the requests and demands and quiet erosions had covered her until even she'd forgotten she existed. I loaded the paintings into my car and drove them to my real home, the condo that was finally mine. I spent the evening arranging them around the living room, leaning them against walls, remembering the stories behind each one. The weekend at Montauk when Harold and I had been young and broke and happy. The rainy afternoon when I'd painted our dining room from memory, trying to capture the golden light that fell across the table during our Sunday dinners. Looking at those paintings was like reading letters from my younger self, reminders of dreams I'd set aside so carefully I'd forgotten I'd ever held them. The next week I bought art supplies. Real ones, not the cheap sets I'd used in my 20s. Professional brushes, tubes of oil paint in colors that sang against my fingertips, canvases stretched and primed and ready for whatever wanted to emerge. I set up a studio space in the second bedroom, the one Michael had been using as an office while telling me it was his bedroom. Floor-to-ceiling windows, perfect northern light, room to make a mess and call it creation. The first painting that came through me wasn't landscape or portrait or still life. It was pure color, angry reds bleeding into determined blues, sharp yellows cutting through muddy browns, and finally, emerging from the chaos, a clear, clean white that looked like hope given form. I painted for 6 hours straight, my arthritic hands moving with remembered skill, time disappearing like it used to when I was young and believed I could capture the whole world in a 2-foot square of canvas. When I finally stepped back, I was covered in paint and exhausted and more alive than I'd felt in years. The woman in the mirror that night was different from the one who'd been sitting in the lawyer's office just months earlier. Paint under her fingernails, silver hair escaping from its careful arrangement, eyes bright with the satisfaction of creating something from nothing. She looked like someone who mattered to herself. Spring came early that year, and with it an invitation I'd been expecting and dreading in equal measure. Tommy's 8th birthday party, mailed to my old address, forwarded to my new one, written in Jennifer's careful handwriting. Eleanor, we would love for you to join us in celebrating Tommy's special day. Saturday, April 12th, 3 p.m. Riverside Park, Pavilion C. We hope you can make it. No mention of the months of silence, the legal battles, the Facebook drama that had divided our extended family. Just a simple invitation that assumed the possibility of normal family relationships. I held the invitation for a long time, remembering other birthday parties. The Chuck E. Cheese celebrations where I'd paid for tokens and pizza and goodie bags. The home parties where I'd arrived early to help set up and stayed late to clean up. The presents bought with careful calculation of my budget and Tommy's wishes, always erring on the side of generosity even when generosity meant generic cereal for another month. Would I go? Should I go? What would it mean to show up or to stay away? I made a list, something Harold had taught me to do when facing difficult decisions. Pros and cons, written out clearly, all emotions aside. Pros. I loved Tommy. This wasn't his fault. Family relationships are complicated but still valuable. I missed being part of celebrations. Cons. Nothing had really changed. No apology had been offered. Attending might signal that I was willing to return to old patterns. The party would likely include requests for money or favors, subtle or direct. The cons list was longer, but the pros list had more emotional weight. I loved Tommy. That simple fact outweighed all the complications his parents had created. So I went shopping for a birthday present, but this time with different rules. I wouldn't spend more than I could easily afford. I wouldn't buy something to impress Michael and Jennifer. I would choose something that reflected my relationship with Tommy, not my relationship with their expectations. I found it in a small bookstore near the park. The Artist's Way for Young People, a guide to creativity for children. It came with a set of colored pencils and a sketchbook. The kind of gift that might plant seeds, that might encourage a young person to see the world as something he could shape and create rather than just consume. The party was exactly what I expected. 24 8-year-olds running through the pavilion while adults stood in small groups making small talk. Michael and Jennifer played hosts, moving through the crowd with practiced smiles, gracious and charming and almost convincing in their portrayal of a happy family celebrating their son's birthday. They saw me arrive but didn't approach immediately. I found a spot at one of the picnic tables and watched Tommy open presents, his face bright with 8-year-old joy as he tore through wrapping paper and revealed treasures both meaningful and trivial. When he unwrapped my gift, he looked puzzled for a moment, then interested. He flipped through the sketchbook, tested the colored pencils on the first page, read the book's subtitle aloud, Discovering and Nurturing Your Creative Spirit. "Thanks, Grandma Eleanor," he said, but I could see the real gratitude in his eyes. This wasn't a toy that would be forgotten in a week. This was an invitation to discover something about himself. Michael appeared at my shoulder as Tommy moved on to the next present. "Mom." His voice was carefully neutral, public appropriate. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I wasn't sure either, but it's Tommy's birthday. That's more important than whatever's happening between us. Maybe we could talk later, after the party." I looked at him. This man who'd systematically deceived me while making me feel grateful for the privilege, and felt nothing but tired sadness. "What would you like to talk about, Michael?" "I think you know." "Actually, I don't. Are you planning to apologize for the fraud? For the years of lying? For throwing my belongings into the street like garbage?" His jaw tightened. "Maybe we could find somewhere more private." "I'm comfortable here. If you have something to say, say it." He glanced around the pavilion, aware that conversations were happening around us, that other parents were within earshot. "Fine. I think you've made your point. You've gotten your condo back. You've made us look bad in front of the whole family. You've cost us thousands of dollars in moving expenses. Don't you think it's time to move past this?" I stared at him, genuinely amazed. After everything that had happened, he still saw himself as the victim in this story. "Move past what, Michael? Move past you stealing from me? Move past you lying to me for years? Move past you treating me like an ATM instead of your mother? You're being dramatic. I never stole anything. That money was freely given. Under false pretenses, while you lied about where it was going and put my financial security at risk." He sighed, the sound of someone dealing with an unreasonable child. "Look, We all know you're not getting any younger. Jennifer and I have been talking, and we think it might be time to consider assisted living. Something nice, where you'd have people to take care of you, activities, social interaction. The suggestion hit me like cold water. Assisted living. The final solution to the problem of Eleanor Robinson, inconvenient mother who'd stopped being convenient. I see. And who would handle my finances while I'm in this nice assisted living facility? Well, naturally, I'd take care of that. As your son. It's what families do. Naturally. Of course. Get me safely warehoused somewhere he could control my environment and access my resources without interference. The perfect plan for someone who saw his elderly mother not as a person, but as a problem to be managed. Thank you for the suggestion, I said calmly. I'll be sure to consider it. Something in my tone must have warned him, because his expression shifted from confident manipulation to wary confusion. What do you mean? I mean, I'll consider it the same way I considered your financial advice all these years. Very carefully, with professional consultation, legal review, full transparency about where my money would go and who would benefit from those decisions. I stood up, gathering my purse and the light jacket I'd brought for the spring afternoon. Where are you going? Home, to my home, the one I own. Mom, we need to finish this conversation. No, Michael, we don't. We finished this conversation months ago when you threw my belongings into the street. Everything since then has just been you trying to find new ways to accomplish the same goals. I walked over to Tommy, who was sitting in the grass with his new sketchbook, drawing what looked like a superhero with rainbow powers. Thank you for inviting me to your party, sweetheart. I hope you enjoy your new art supplies. Grandma Eleanor, are you leaving already? I am. But you have my phone number if you ever want to show me what you've drawn. He nodded solemnly, then surprised me by standing up and hugging me around the waist. I love you, Grandma Eleanor. I love you too, Tommy. So much. And then I left. Not in anger, not in sadness, but in the quiet dignity of someone who'd finally learned the difference between being needed and being used, between loving someone and enabling them to hurt you. The train ride back to Manhattan was peaceful. I sat by the window, watching the city roll past, feeling lighter with each mile between me and that pavilion where my family was probably already discussing my difficult behavior and concerning mental state. Let them create whatever narrative they needed to avoid examining their own actions. I was done participating in their fiction. That evening, I called a travel agent. Not to research Ireland. Not yet. But to book something smaller, more immediate. A weekend in Woodstock, where there were galleries and art studios and people who understood that creativity was its own justification. Just yourself? The agent asked. Just myself. Any special accommodations? Dietary restrictions? Mobility concerns? No restrictions at all, I said, and realized as I said it that it was true. For the first time in decades, I had no restrictions except the ones I chose for myself. The weekend in Woodstock was a revelation. I stayed in a small bed and breakfast run by a retired schoolteacher who served homemade granola and fair trade coffee. I visited studios where artists my age and older were still creating, still pushing boundaries, still believing that their visions mattered enough to manifest in clay and paint and metal and wood. How long have you been painting? Asked Sarah, a woman about my age whose watercolors hung in the local gallery. I started again recently, after a long break. 25 years or so. What brought you back to it? I considered the question seriously. I think I finally had enough room in my life for my own dreams. She nodded like she understood exactly what I meant. I took 30 years off when my kids were young and my husband was starting his practice. I told myself I'd get back to it someday, and someday finally arrived when I realized no one was going to give me permission. I had to give it to myself. That conversation stayed with me on the train ride home. Permission. How much of my life had I spent waiting for someone else's permission to exist fully, to take up space, to matter? And how much energy had I wasted being grateful to people who saw my gratitude as confirmation that they deserved whatever they were taking? Summer brought new routines, new rhythms to my days. I painted in the mornings when the light was best. I took long walks in Central Park, feeding ducks and reading on benches like a proper Manhattan retiree. I cooked elaborate meals for one, learning to find joy in the act of nourishing myself well rather than efficiently. I joined a book club that met in a coffee shop near Lincoln Center, where 12 women and 3 men gathered monthly to discuss literature and life with the passionate intensity that comes from having lived long enough to recognize truth when it appears on the page. These people knew nothing about my family drama, my financial struggles, my decades of self-sacrifice. To them, I was simply Eleanor, the woman who painted watercolors and always had insightful things to say about character motivation. It was liberating to be seen for who I was rather than what I could provide. The first Christmas in my new life approached with both promise and trepidation. I'd received no invitation to Michael and Jennifer's celebration, which was both expected and still painful. Tommy sent me a hand-drawn Christmas card that showed the two of us painting together, him at a small easel and me at a large one. "I hope you have a good Christmas, Grandma Eleanor. I miss you," he'd written in careful 8-year-old cursive. I cried over that card, but not from sadness. From gratitude that this small person had thought of me, had taken the time to create something beautiful to bridge the distance his parents had created. I mailed him back a card with one of my own paintings printed on the front, a winter scene from Central Park, and a note telling him how much his artwork meant to me. Rather than spend Christmas alone, I volunteered at a soup kitchen in Queens, serving meals to people who'd fallen through society's safety nets. Some were homeless, some were working poor, some were elderly people whose families had either died or drifted away. They thanked me for the food, for the warm smiles, for treating them like human beings deserving of dignity rather than objects of pity. "You're like an angel," said one man, probably my age, whose clothes were clean but worn, "coming out on Christmas to help people like us." "People like us," I corrected gently. "We're all just people trying to take care of each other." He looked surprised, then nodded. "You're right about that." That Christmas taught me something important about service. For 25 years, I'd been serving my family's wants while resenting the absence of gratitude. But here, serving actual needs with no expectation of return, generosity felt pure again. Clean. Right. The difference was choice. I was choosing to be here, choosing to help, choosing to pour my energy into something that aligned with my values rather than depleting them. Spring came again, and with it, my 70th birthday. I'd been dreading it. The first birthday since Harold's death that I'd spend entirely alone, with no family obligations to distract me from the passage of time. But loneliness, I discovered, wasn't the same as solitude. Loneliness was sitting in a room full of people who saw you only as a resource to be exploited. Solitude was sitting in your own space, surrounded by your own choices, free to mark your own milestones in your own way. I spent my birthday morning painting a self-portrait, something I'd never attempted before. The woman who looked back at me from the canvas wasn't young, wasn't trying to appear younger. She had lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter and tears both. Her silver hair caught light like spun moonbeams. Her hands, spotted with age and twisted slightly with arthritis, held a paintbrush with the confidence of someone who'd learned to trust her own vision. She looked like someone who'd survived something difficult and emerged not unscathed, but stronger. Someone who'd learned to value herself, not for what she could provide others, but for who she was when no one was asking for anything. That afternoon, I took myself to lunch at a restaurant in Little Italy I'd always wanted to try but never had because it was too expensive for someone supporting multiple households. I ordered wine with my meal, tiramisu for dessert, and lingered over coffee while watching people walk past the window, everyone absorbed in their own stories, their own struggles and celebrations. The waiter, a kind man, probably my grandson's age, asked if I was celebrating anything special. My birthday, I told him. 70, I added, because there was no shame in it anymore. Well, happy birthday. Are you waiting for family to join you? No, I said, and discovered the answer didn't hurt. I'm celebrating by myself. It's exactly what I wanted to do. He smiled like he understood that this was a choice, not a sad circumstance. The best kind of celebration, then, when you're exactly where you want to be, doing exactly what makes you happy. Exactly what makes me happy. When was the last time anyone had asked me that question? When was the last time I'd asked it of myself? That evening, I called Linda in Florida. How was your birthday, Eleanor? Perfect, I said, and meant it. Absolutely perfect. What did you do? I painted. I had lunch at that little Italian place I'd been wanting to try. I bought myself fresh flowers and a bottle of good wine. I read a book I've been saving. I watched the sunset from my balcony. That sounds lovely and peaceful. It was. Linda, I think I'm ready for that Ireland trip we talked about. She squealed like a teenager. Really? Oh, Eleanor, that's wonderful. When are you thinking? Fall, maybe. After the summer tourists have gone home, I want to see the countryside when it's quiet. Have you told Michael and Jennifer about your travel plans? The question surprised me. Why would I tell them? They weren't part of this decision, weren't funding it, weren't invited. The old Eleanor would have felt obligated to check with them first, to make sure her plans didn't conflict with any needs they might have for her time or money. The new Eleanor recognized that her travel plans were none of their business. No, I said simply. I haven't. Good for you, Linda said, and I could hear the approval in her voice. It's your life, your money, your adventure. You don't need anyone's permission to live it. Permission. There was that word again. How much of my life had been spent seeking permission that was never mine to ask for in the first place? The Ireland trip exceeded every expectation I'd held during all those years of dreaming about it. I stayed in small hotels, ate in local pubs, walked ancient paths that had been worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims and wanderers. I painted landscapes that took my breath away, green fields that seemed to glow from within, stone cottages that looked like they'd grown from the earth itself, skies that shifted from blue to gray to silver with the rhythm of living weather. But the most beautiful part of the trip wasn't the scenery. It was the person I discovered I could be when freed from the weight of other people's expectations. I talked to strangers in pubs, joined conversations about poetry and politics and the price of sheep. I laughed with a tour group of retirees from Australia who'd been traveling together for 15 years. I sat in ancient churches and felt connected not to God exactly, but to the long line of humans who'd sought meaning in stone and silence. I felt Harold with me on that trip, not as grief, but as joy. I could imagine him beside me at the dinner table, sharing stories with our fellow travelers, pointing out details in the landscape that only he would notice. The trip we'd planned together became a gift I gave myself, and somehow that made it more meaningful, not less. When I returned to New York, tan and energized and carrying a suitcase full of paintings and memories, I found a message waiting on my answering machine. Mom, it's Michael. We need to talk. There's been a situation with Tommy's school, and we could really use your help. Call me back. I listened to the message 3 times, hearing not just the words but the tone, the assumption that I'd be available, eager to help, grateful to be needed again, the casual expectation that this call would restart the old patterns as if nothing had changed. I deleted the message without returning the call. 2 days later, Jennifer called. Her voice was tight with frustration, barely held in check. "Eleanor, I don't know why you're not responding to Michael's calls, but this is about Tommy. Surely you care enough about your grandson to at least hear what's happening." The guilt was expertly applied. She'd identified the one relationship that still held emotional weight for me and weaponized it with surgical precision. The old Eleanor would have crumbled immediately, calling Michael back with apologies and checkbook ready. The new Eleanor recognized manipulation even when it came wrapped in genuine concern for a child she loved. "What's happening with Tommy?" I asked. "He's been having problems at school, acting out, not completing assignments. The counselor thinks he needs private tutoring, maybe some therapy to help him process the family changes. But our insurance doesn't cover the kind of help he needs, and the good tutors are expensive." Family changes. An interesting way to describe fraud, theft, and eviction. "That sounds difficult," I said. "What are you planning to do?" "Well, we were hoping you might consider helping with the costs. For Tommy's sake." For Tommy's sake? The magic words that had opened my wallet so many times before. "Have you applied for sliding scale therapy through the school district? There are usually resources available for families who can't afford private services." Silence. Then, carefully controlled anger. "We shouldn't have to accept charity. We're not poor, Eleanor. We just have temporary cash flow issues because of all the moving expenses and legal fees from this situation you created." This situation I created. By refusing to be stolen from. By reclaiming my own property. By expecting honesty from my own son. "I'm sorry Tommy is struggling," I said, meaning it completely. "But my financial help hasn't been good for any of us. You'll have to find another solution." "So you're just going to abandon your grandson when he needs you most?" "I'm going to love him without enabling his parents to avoid the consequences of their choices. Those aren't the same thing." Jennifer's composure finally cracked. "You're a selfish, bitter old woman. Michael was right. You've completely changed. The Eleanor we knew would never turn her back on family like this." "You're absolutely right," I said calmly. "The Eleanor you knew wouldn't have. That Eleanor was devoted to keeping peace at any cost, even her own well-being. That Eleanor believed love meant saying yes to every request, no matter how unreasonable. That Eleanor is gone." "And good riddance," I added, surprising myself with the vehemence in my voice. She was making everyone miserable, including herself. The line went dead. Jennifer had hung up on me, something that would have devastated me a year earlier. Now it just felt like the end of a conversation that should have happened long ago. But I'd lied about one thing. I was worried about Tommy. Not enough to resume funding Michael and Jennifer's lifestyle, but enough to send a card with a note telling him I loved him and believed he was strong enough to handle whatever was troubling him. I included my phone number and told him he could call me any time if he needed someone to listen. He called that Saturday morning. "Grandma Eleanor, it's Tommy." "Tommy? How wonderful to hear your voice. How are you, sweetheart?" "I'm okay. Mom said you were too busy to help us anymore." I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar stab of anger at the way they'd framed my boundaries as abandonment. "I'm not too busy for you, Tommy. I'm always here if you need to talk, or if there's something I can do that doesn't involve money." Mom says everything involves money. Out of the mouths of babes. Jennifer had revealed more about their worldview than she'd intended. "That's not true, sweetheart. Love doesn't cost money. Listening doesn't cost money. Caring about each other doesn't cost money." "I know. That's why I wanted to call you, to tell you I made something for you." "What did you make?" "A painting, like the ones you do. It's not very good, but I tried really hard." My throat tightened with emotion. This child, caught between his parents' dysfunction and his own innocent need for connection, was reaching across the divide they'd created to maintain our relationship. "I would love to see it. Would you like to meet me somewhere and show it to me?" A pause. Then quietly, I don't think Mom and Dad would let me. Of course they wouldn't. My relationship with Tommy was valuable to them only as leverage to extract money and compliance. Without that utility, they had no reason to facilitate our bond. I understand, but Tommy, I want you to know something important. I love you exactly the same as I always have. The problems between me and your parents don't change that at all. I love you too, Grandma Eleanor. I wish things weren't so complicated. Complicated is a good word for it. But sometimes complicated situations teach us important things about ourselves and the people we love. We talked for 20 more minutes about school, his art projects, a book he was reading. Normal grandmother-grandson conversation that felt precious because it was so simple. When he had to go, he promised to call again soon. And Grandma Eleanor, I'm going to keep painting, even if Mom and Dad don't understand why. Good for you, sweetheart. Art isn't about other people understanding. It's about expressing what's true for you. After he hung up, I sat in my living room looking at my own paintings, thinking about the courage it takes to create something from nothing, to put your vision into the world whether or not anyone else sees its value. Tommy was learning that lesson earlier than I had, but perhaps that would serve him better in the long run. The autumn of my new life brought unexpected gifts. The book club I'd joined asked if I'd be interested in leading a discussion about art and literature. Several members had seen my paintings at a local coffee shop where the owner displayed work by community artists. The pottery class asked me to help teach a workshop for seniors who were just beginning their creative journeys. Most surprisingly, Mrs. Ramirez from my old building called to ask a favor. Eleanor, I know this might sound strange, but my daughter is getting married next month, and she's been looking for someone to paint a portrait of her and her fiancé. Nothing fancy, just something personal for their first home. I showed her the painting you gave me when you moved, and she fell in love with your style. Mrs. Ramirez's daughter, Carmen, was a nurse at Mount Sinai who'd been saving for a wedding portrait but found photography too expensive and commissioned art beyond her budget. She offered me $300 for a small painting based on a photograph from their engagement session. $300. Not life-changing money, but money earned through my own skill, my own labor, my own vision. Money that represented value I created rather than resources I'd accumulated through years of deprivation and sacrifice. I accepted the commission, and word spread through networks I didn't even know existed. Mrs. Chen from down the hall wanted a painting of her late husband's garden. The bookstore owner commissioned a small landscape for his shop. A woman from the pottery class asked me to paint a portrait of her beloved dog who'd recently died. By Christmas, I had a waiting list of people who wanted Eleanor Robinson originals, not because they pitied an elderly woman trying to stay busy, but because they recognized something authentic in my work, something worth paying for. I opened a small business account and had cards printed. Eleanor Robinson, portrait and landscape artist. Below my name, my phone number, and a line that had become my unofficial motto, bringing your vision to life. The financial independence was meaningful, but the recognition was transformative. These strangers saw value in my work that my own family had never acknowledged. They trusted me to capture their most precious memories, their beloved faces, their sacred places. They paid me for my vision, my skill, my time. For the first time in my adult life, I was earning money by being exactly who I was rather than by shrinking myself to fit other people's needs. New Year's Eve found me at a small party hosted by Sarah, the artist I'd met in Woodstock. A dozen creative people gathered in her Brooklyn studio, sharing food and wine and stories of the year past and the year ahead. Musicians, writers, painters, a sculptor who worked in found objects, a photographer who specialized in urban landscapes. We went around the table at midnight, each person sharing one thing they were grateful for and one thing they hoped for in the coming year. When it was my turn, I looked around at these people who'd become friends, who knew me as Eleanor the painter, rather than Eleanor the mother ATM. and felt overwhelmed with possibility. "I'm grateful for discovering that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be," I said. "And I hope for the courage to keep growing into that person." The sculptor, a woman named Joan who was at least 80 and still creating bold, controversial art, raised her glass. "To Eleanor, who reminds us that rebirth is always possible." They toasted me, these artists who understood that creativity was essential rather than frivolous, that self-expression was a form of self-respect, that it was possible to start over at any age. Spring brought Tommy's 9th birthday, and with it, another invitation. This one came directly from Tommy, hand-delivered by Mrs. Ramirez, who'd run into Jennifer at the grocery store. "He asked me to give this to you personally," she said with a knowing smile. "He's a smart boy, that one." The invitation was hand-drawn, decorated with crayon flowers and glitter stars. "Please come to my birthday party, Grandma Eleanor. Saturday, April 18th, 2 p.m., Central Park near the Alice in Wonderland statue. I have something special to show you." No mention of Michael and Jennifer. No RSVP information. Just a child's earnest desire for his grandmother's presence at his celebration. I almost didn't go. The risk of confrontation, of being made unwelcome, of having my presence turned into leverage for emotional or financial manipulation, seemed too high. But then I remembered Tommy's voice on the phone, his determination to keep painting even without parental support, his innocent faith that love could transcend adult complications. I went, carrying a wrapped set of professional-grade colored pencils and a leather-bound sketchbook. Quality supplies for a young artist who was learning to trust his own vision. I saw them before they saw me. Michael and Jennifer spreading a blanket near the playground while Tommy ran ahead to the statue, his small hands carrying something carefully wrapped in tissue paper. A few other families had gathered, friends from school and their parents, the normal chaos of a child's birthday party in the park. Michael spotted me first. His face went through several expressions: surprise, resignation, calculation, before settling on polite wariness. "Mom, I wasn't sure you'd come. Tommy invited me." "Right. Well, good." He glanced at Jennifer, who was pointedly not looking in my direction. "Maybe we can keep things pleasant. For Tommy's sake." For Tommy's sake. Everything was always for Tommy's sake, except the things that actually served Tommy's best interests. "Of course," I said. "This is his day." Tommy ran over then, his face bright with 9-year-old excitement, and hugged me around the waist with the unself-conscious affection that made my heart ache with love for this sweet child, caught in the middle of adult dysfunction. "Grandma Eleanor, you came. I have something to show you, but first we have to do the cake and presents." The party proceeded with typical childhood birthday chaos. Tommy opened gifts with appropriate enthusiasm, posed for photographs with varying degrees of cooperation, and blew out 9 candles while making a wish he whispered to me afterward. "I wished for you to always be my grandma, no matter what." Always your grandma, no matter what. The simple truth that transcended all the complicated emotions and financial manipulations and wounded pride that had driven wedges through our family. After the formal festivities ended and the other families began packing up to leave, Tommy approached me with his carefully wrapped package. "This is for you," he said solemnly. "I made it myself, and Mom and Dad don't know what it is yet." I unwrapped the tissue paper to reveal a canvas about the size of a piece of notebook paper. On it, Tommy had painted 2 figures sitting together at easels, both holding paintbrushes, both focused on the canvases in front of them. The brushwork was enthusiastic rather than skilled, the proportions imperfect, the colors applied with more passion than precision. But the love in it was unmistakable. The careful attention to detail, my silver hair, the flowers on my favorite painting dress, the concentrated expression on both our faces. This wasn't just a painting. This was Tommy's vision of our relationship, 2 artists working side by side, sharing the joy of creation. "It's us," he said unnecessarily. Painting together. Like I hope we can do someday for real. I looked at this precious gift, this expression of pure love untainted by manipulation or hidden agendas, and felt tears spring to my eyes. It's the most beautiful painting I've ever seen, I told him, meaning every word. I'm going to hang it in my studio, right where I can see it while I work. Really? In your real art studio? In my real art studio. It will inspire me every day. Michael had drifted over during this exchange, and I saw him looking at the painting with an expression I couldn't quite read. That's nice, Tommy. Very thoughtful. But Tommy wasn't satisfied with polite approval from his father. He was looking at me with the intensity that comes from a child's need to be truly seen and understood. Grandma Eleanor, would you teach me to paint sometime? Like really paint, not just kid stuff? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that went far beyond art instruction. This was Tommy asking for a relationship independent of his parents, asking for a connection based on shared interest rather than family obligation. I glanced at Michael and Jennifer, both of whom were watching this interaction with careful attention. Jennifer's face showed the kind of strategic thinking that meant she was calculating whether my teaching Tommy art might somehow benefit them financially or practically. I would love to teach you to paint, I said carefully, but that's something you'd need to discuss with your parents. Can I, Dad? Please? Michael looked between his son's eager face and my cautious one, clearly working through the implications. We'll see, he said finally. We'll talk about it at home. We'll see. The universal parent phrase that meant no without the immediate disappointment. I recognized the dismissal even if Tommy didn't yet. As families began leaving the park, Tommy hugged me goodbye with the fierce intensity that suggested he understood, on some level, that these moments were precious because they were rare. Thank you for coming to my party, Grandma Eleanor. And thank you for liking my painting. Thank you for inviting me, sweetheart. And thank you for the most wonderful gift I could imagine. I walked to the subway alone, carrying Tommy's painting and the complicated emotions that came with loving someone caught between you and people who saw that love as either weapon or weakness. On the train home, I studied Tommy's portrait of us painting together and made a decision. Whether or not his parents allowed formal art lessons, I would find ways to nurture his creativity. Care packages with art supplies, books about famous artists, cards with prints of paintings that might inspire him. Support that couldn't be stopped or controlled because it required nothing from Michael and Jennifer except allowing their son to receive mail. That evening, I framed Tommy's painting and hung it in my studio, right above my easel where I could see it every time I picked up a brush. Looking at it, I saw not just a child's artwork, but a vision of relationship based on mutual interest and genuine affection. Love without agenda, connection without cost. It was the kind of relationship I'd been trying to have with Michael for 45 years, offering my whole self in hope of receiving some genuine part of him in return. The kind of relationship that's only possible between people who see each other as valuable for who they are rather than what they provide. Tommy, at 9 years old, already understood something about love that his parents had never learned. And in his painting, he'd given me a gift more precious than money or apologies, or even acknowledgement of past wrongs. He'd given me hope that authentic connection was still possible, even in the midst of family dysfunction. The summer of my new life brought an unexpected opportunity. The coffee shop that displayed my paintings was expanding into a small gallery space, and they asked if I'd be interested in having a solo show. 20 paintings, displayed for 6 weeks, with an opening reception where people could meet the artist and purchase work directly. My first art show. At 74 years old, I was finally going to be featured as a professional artist. I spent weeks preparing, selecting pieces that represented the journey from my early landscapes to my recent portraits, arranging them in a sequence that told the story of a woman discovering her voice through color and canvas. The gallery owner, Marcus, helped me write an artist's statement that captured what I was trying to say through my work. These paintings represent an exploration of identity, resilience, and the courage required to honor one's authentic self. Created over a lifetime of learning that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. The opening reception was scheduled for a Thursday evening in July. I bought a new dress, not practical, sensible clothes, but something beautiful that made me feel like the artist I'd become. Deep blue silk that brought out my eyes, comfortable but elegant shoes, jewelry that Harold had given me years ago, but I'd rarely worn because it seemed too fancy for my small life. Looking in the mirror before leaving for the gallery, I saw someone I barely recognized. Confident, creative, completely present in her own skin. This woman didn't apologize for taking up space, didn't defer to other people's opinions about what she should want or need or dream. The reception exceeded my modest expectations. 23 people came, including several members of my book club, the pottery class instructor, Mrs. Ramirez and her daughter Carmen, and several strangers who'd been drawn in by the inviting lights and curious about the work on display. I sold 4 paintings that night, including the self-portrait I'd completed on my 70th birthday. The woman who bought it was a therapist who worked with older adults. "This captures something I try to help my clients find," she told me. "That sense of self-worth that comes from inside rather than from other people's approval. Self-worth that comes from inside." How had it taken me 7 decades to understand that concept? But the most meaningful moment of the evening came near the end, when I was talking to a couple about a landscape they were considering purchasing. I looked up to see a familiar figure in the doorway, Tommy, holding Jennifer's hand, both of them looking around the gallery with wide eyes. They approached slowly, taking in the paintings, reading the little cards that explained each piece. Tommy stopped in front of the portrait he'd painted for me, which I'd included in the show with a special note, "Gift from the Artist, by Tommy Robinson, age 9. This painting hangs in my studio and reminds me daily that art is about connection, love, and seeing each other truly." "Grandma Eleanor," Tommy's voice carried across the gallery as he spotted me. "This is your art show. These are all your paintings." He ran over, his face bright with excitement and pride. "Mom, look! Grandma Eleanor is a real artist. Her paintings are in a real gallery." Jennifer followed more slowly, her expression carefully neutral as she took in the scene. Her former mother-in-law surrounded by admirers, professionally displayed artwork, wine glasses and cheese plates, and the general atmosphere of cultural respectability. "This is quite impressive, Eleanor," she said, and I could hear the surprise in her voice. She'd expected to find an elderly woman playing at being artistic, not a legitimate show in an actual gallery. "Thank you. I'm so glad Tommy could see it." Tommy was practically vibrating with excitement, moving from painting to painting, studying each one with the intensity of a serious art critic. "Did you really paint all of these? By yourself?" "I did. Every single one." "How long did it take?" "Some took days, some took weeks." "This one," I pointed to a complex landscape of Central Park in autumn, "took me 2 months to finish. Could you teach me how to make ones like this?" The question I'd been expecting, delivered with the innocent directness that adults had forgotten how to use. Tommy didn't understand the complexities and complications his parents had created. He just saw his grandmother's artwork and wanted to learn from her. Before I could answer, Jennifer stepped in. "Tommy, that's not something we need to discuss right now. This is Grandma Eleanor's special evening." But Marcus, the gallery owner, had overheard our conversation. "Are you interested in learning to paint, young man?" Tommy nodded enthusiastically. "Well, your grandmother is an excellent teacher. She's been helping with our beginner workshops, and her students love working with her." Marcus turned to me with a smile. "Eleanor, didn't you mention wanting to start a class specifically for young people? This might be the perfect student to help you design the curriculum." I looked at Tommy's eager face. then at Jennifer's carefully controlled expression, understanding that this was one of those moments that could either build bridges or create deeper divisions. "I would love to teach Tommy," I said carefully, "if his parents think it's appropriate." "Please, Mom." Tommy looked up at Jennifer with the kind of hope that's painful to deny. "I really want to learn." Jennifer glanced around the gallery, taking in the evidence of my artistic success, the respect I'd clearly earned in this community, the way people were treating me as someone worth listening to rather than someone to be managed. "We'll discuss it," she said finally. "This isn't the time or place." But Tommy, emboldened by being in his grandmother's gallery surrounded by her artwork, pressed his advantage. "But you always say we should learn from experts, and Grandma Eleanor is an expert. Look at all these paintings." Out of the mouths of babes. Jennifer found herself trapped by her own parenting rhetoric, unable to argue against Tommy learning from an expert without explaining why this particular expert was unsuitable. "We'll talk about it at home," she said firmly, but I could see in her expression that Tommy had scored a significant victory. After they left, I stood in the gallery surrounded by my paintings and the lingering energy of an evening that had exceeded every hope I'd held. 4 pieces sold, dozens of people expressing genuine appreciation for my work, and most importantly, my grandson seeing me not as a source of funds or a problem to be managed, but as someone who created beautiful things that strangers valued enough to purchase. Marcus began switching off lights and locking up, but he paused beside me near the window where my self-portrait had hung before being sold. "You know, Eleanor, I've been running galleries for 15 years, and I can usually tell which artists are going to keep growing and which ones have peaked. You're just getting started." Just getting started. At 74, with a lifetime of deferred dreams finally being honored, I was just getting started. The phone call came 3 days later. Tommy calling from his father's cell phone while Michael was at work. "Grandma Eleanor? Mom said I could take art lessons with you if we could work out the details." Details. The word that usually meant money, schedules, control, conditions. "What kind of details, sweetheart?" "She said I could come to your studio once a week for an hour, but it has to be convenient for everyone's schedule, and Dad needs to approve what I'm learning." Of course he did. Michael needed to approve his son's art education, as if creativity could somehow be subversive or dangerous if not properly supervised. "That sounds reasonable," I said, though I recognized the parameters being set. 1 hour a week, my schedule subordinated to theirs, my teaching subject to Michael's oversight. Still, it was a beginning. "And Grandma Eleanor?" "Mom said these have to be real art lessons, not just playing around. She said if you're going to teach me, I need to learn properly." Real art lessons, not just playing around. I smiled at Jennifer's attempt to make my gift to Tommy sound like work, like obligation, like something serious enough to justify their allowing it. "Oh, they'll be very real," I assured him. "We're going to learn about color theory, composition, different painting techniques. By the end of the summer, you'll know enough to create art that expresses exactly what you want to say." Even if what I want to say is complicated? The question caught me off guard with its sophistication. What 9-year-old thinks about art as a way of expressing complicated ideas? Especially if what you want to say is complicated. That's what art is for, Tommy. Expressing things that are too complex for regular words. Good. I have a lot of complicated things I want to express. Don't we all? I thought. Don't we all? Tommy's first official art lesson was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in August. He arrived precisely on time with a small backpack containing a notebook, pencils, and the intense focus of a child who'd been told this was serious business. I'd prepared carefully, setting up a child-sized easel beside my regular one, organizing supplies at his level, planning exercises that would teach fundamental skills while keeping his interest. But when he walked into my studio and saw his portrait of us hanging above my easel, his composure cracked into pure joy. "You really did hang it up, In your real studio. It's the first thing I see every morning when I come in here to work. It reminds me why I paint. Why do you paint? The question every artist gets asked, and the one that's hardest to answer simply. Why do we create? Why do we feel compelled to translate inner vision into external form? Why does the act of making something beautiful feel necessary rather than optional? I looked at this earnest child, bright with curiosity and trust, and tried to find words that would make sense to a 9-year-old mind. Because I have things inside me that need to come out, and painting is how they find their way into the world. And because when I paint, I feel most like myself. He nodded solemnly, like this made perfect sense. I think that's why I want to learn. I have things inside me too. We started with basics: how to hold a brush, how colors mix together to create new colors, how light and shadow give objects dimension and depth. Tommy absorbed everything with the intensity of someone who'd been hungry for exactly this kind of knowledge. But it was when we moved from technical exercises to actual expression that something magical happened. I asked him to paint something that made him happy, expecting a typical child's response: a sunny day, a favorite toy, a pet, a playground. Instead, he painted a small figure sitting alone in a large room, surrounded by swirls of color that seemed to be dancing around him like friendly spirits. "Tell me about this painting," I said. "That's me in my room when everyone else is busy with grown-up stuff. I'm not sad, because I can see beautiful things that keep me company. But I wish the grown-ups could see them, too." I stared at this small masterpiece, recognizing something profound in its simple honesty. This child had captured the essential loneliness of being sensitive in a world that values different things, and he'd found a way to make that loneliness beautiful rather than pitiful. "Tommy, this is extraordinary. You've painted something true and important." "Really? It's not just kid stuff?" "It's not kid stuff at all. It's art. Real art." The hour passed quickly, and when Jennifer arrived to pick him up, Tommy was glowing with accomplishment and paint-stained pride. "Look what I made, Mom." He held up his painting, eager for her approval. Jennifer studied it with the careful attention of someone trying to find the right response. "It's very colorful," she said finally. "What is it supposed to be?" "It's me, and it's about being alone but not lonely. Grandma Eleanor says it's real art." Jennifer glanced at me, and I saw something in her expression that might have been respect or surprise, or possibly the first recognition that her son's relationship with me existed independently of her ability to control or understand it. "It's quite sophisticated for a 9-year-old, she admitted. "Eleanor, what exactly are you teaching him?" "How to see what he's feeling and find ways to express it visually. How to trust his own vision. How to make something beautiful from whatever is true for him. And this is appropriate for a child his age?" The question revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of creativity, her assumption that artistic expression could somehow be inappropriate or dangerous if not carefully monitored. "Art is always appropriate," I said gently. "It's how humans have been processing their inner lives for thousands of years. Tommy has something to say, and I'm just helping him find ways to say it." She nodded, but I could see her filing this information away, calculating its significance in ways I couldn't predict. Over the following weeks, Tommy's artistic skills developed rapidly, but more importantly, his confidence in his own perceptions grew stronger. He painted emotions as colors, relationships as geometric shapes, dreams as landscapes that existed nowhere on Earth but felt completely real. His parents occasionally asked to see his work, and I watched Michael struggle to find appropriate responses to paintings that revealed depths in his son he'd never recognized. "It's very creative," he would say, examining a canvas covered with swirling blues and greens that Tommy had titled, "What Music Looks Like." "Do you understand what I'm trying to show you, Dad?" Michael would study the painting with the concentration of someone trying to solve a puzzle, looking for literal meaning in abstract expression. "Help me understand," he would say, and Tommy would launch into explanations of how different instruments create different colors, how melody moves in spirals while rhythm moves in geometric patterns, how the whole symphony creates a landscape you could walk through if you knew how to see it. And Michael would nod and smile and clearly have no idea what his son was talking about, but he was trying. In his limited way, he was trying to connect with this aspect of Tommy that had been invisible to him before. One afternoon in late September, as summer was transitioning to fall and our weekly lessons had established themselves as the briest part of both our weeks, Tommy arrived with unusual excitement. "Grandma Eleanor, I want to paint something for Mom and Dad, but I need your help figuring out how." "What do you want to paint?" "I want to paint what our family looks like. Not just how we look, but what we feel like. Does that make sense?" It made perfect sense, and it was also the most complex artistic challenge he'd attempted. How do you paint the dynamics of a family? The tensions and love and disappointment and hope that exist between people who are bound together by blood and history and obligation. "That's a very ambitious project," I told him. "But I think you're ready for it. Tell me what your family feels like to you." He thought about this seriously, his young face scrunched with concentration. "Sometimes it feels like everyone is in different rooms, even when we're all together. Like we're all speaking different languages, but we love each other. We just don't know how to show it right." What a profound observation from such a young person. Tommy had identified the central tragedy of his family: love that couldn't find effective expression, connection that was blocked by patterns of miscommunication and unmet needs. We spent 3 sessions working on his family portrait. Not a traditional representation of 3 people posing together, but an abstract exploration of emotional relationships. He painted 4 separate areas connected by thin, tentative lines of light. His parents' sections were geometric and structured, filled with sharp angles and muted colors. His section was organic and flowing, full of the swirling colors and dancing shapes that characterized all his work. And in the upper corner, almost like an afterthought but somehow essential to the composition, he painted a small area labeled Grandma Eleanor that looked like a garden. Controlled but not rigid, colorful but harmonious, a place where other colors could come to rest. "I painted you like this because you help me understand the other parts," he explained. "You help me see that Dad's sharp edges aren't mean. They're just how he thinks. And Mom's straight lines aren't boring. They're how she keeps everything organized. But you also help me stay curvy and colorful, you know?" I knew. I was the translator between Tommy's artistic soul and his practical parents, the bridge that allowed connection across fundamentally different ways of seeing the world. When the painting was finished, Tommy stared at it with the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully communicated something important. "Do you think they'll understand it?" he asked. "I think they'll understand that you love them and see them clearly, even when you're different from them. And I think they'll be amazed by how talented and thoughtful you are. Will you help me explain it to them? If they ask, I'll help. But Tommy, this is your painting, your vision, your gift to them. Trust yourself to know what it means." The family portrait was presented on a Sunday evening, after dinner, with the ceremony that important occasions deserve. Tommy called his parents into the living room, positioned the painting on the mantel, and took a deep breath before beginning his explanation. "This is our family," he announced. "Not just what we look like, but what we feel like." Michael and Jennifer studied the painting with expressions I couldn't quite read. Confusion, certainly, but also something like recognition, as if they were seeing their relationships reflected in ways they'd never considered. "Tell us about it," Jennifer said after a long moment. Tommy launched into his explanation, pointing to different areas of the canvas and describing what each section represented. How the connecting lines showed love that was sometimes hard to express. How the different colors and shapes showed that being different from each other didn't mean not belonging together. "And this is Grandma Eleanor," he said, pointing to the garden corner. "She helps all the other parts make sense together." Michael looked at that small section of the painting, then at me, then back at the canvas. "Why did you paint her like that?" he asked his son. "Because she helps me understand you and Mom better, and she helps me be myself at the same time. Like she speaks everyone's language, you know?" I felt tears prick my eyes at this child's assessment of my role in his life. Not as a problem to be managed or a resource to be exploited, but as someone who helped him navigate the complexities of loving people who were fundamentally different from him. Jennifer was studying the painting with the intensity of someone trying to decode a message written in a foreign language. "It's very sophisticated," she said finally. "I can see how much work you put into it." "But do you understand what I'm trying to say?" Tommy pressed, seeking more than polite appreciation for his effort. Jennifer looked at her son, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time seeing not just a child to be managed and directed, but a person with his own complex inner life and unique way of processing the world. "I think you're saying that we're all different, but we still belong together, and that even when we don't understand each other perfectly, we still love each other." Tommy's face blazed with joy at being truly heard and understood. "Yes, exactly. And that being different is okay because it makes the painting more interesting." Michael nodded slowly, still studying the canvas. "Son, this is really impressive. You've learned so much in your art lessons." "Grandma Eleanor says I have a natural talent, but talent is just the starting place. The important part is learning how to use it to say true things." Learning how to use it to say true things. My words, coming back to me through this child who'd absorbed not just artistic technique, but artistic philosophy. That evening, after Tommy had gone to bed and I was preparing to leave, Jennifer walked me to the door. "Eleanor, I owe you an apology." The words I'd given up hoping to hear, spoken simply and without fanfare. "For what?" "For not seeing what these art lessons have been giving Tommy. I thought you were just, I don't know, keeping him busy. But you've been teaching him how to think about his feelings, how to express complex ideas, how to see beauty in complicated things." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "He's been happier since he started working with you. More confident, better able to articulate what he needs or wants. The problems at school that we were so worried about? They've mostly disappeared." I had noticed that Tommy seemed more settled, more comfortable in his own skin during our recent lessons. Art has that effect. When you learn to trust your own vision, when you develop confidence in your ability to express what's true for you, that confidence carries over into all areas of life. "Tommy has always had these gifts," I told Jennifer. "He just needed permission to develop them. Permission we weren't giving him." It was a statement, not a question, and it carried the weight of parental recognition that they'd been trying to shape their son into something he wasn't, instead of helping him become more fully who he was. "You weren't giving him what you didn't know he needed, but now you do know." She nodded, then surprised me with the next question. "Would you be willing to continue the art lessons? Permanently, I mean. Not just as a temporary arrangement. Permanently. A commitment to ongoing relationship based on mutual benefit rather than desperate need." Tommy received art education that nurtured his talents and helped him understand himself better. I received the joy of teaching someone who was genuinely eager to learn, the satisfaction of watching creativity flourish under careful guidance. "I would love to continue teaching Tommy," I said, "as long as he wants to keep learning. I think he'll want to keep learning from you for a very long time." That conversation marked the beginning of a new chapter in my relationship with Tommy's family. Not a return to old patterns, but something entirely different. A relationship based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. Clear boundaries rather than unlimited availability. Appreciation for what I offered rather than assumption that I owed whatever they needed. Michael remained more distant, still processing the shift in family dynamics, still struggling to reconcile his image of his elderly mother with the reality of the independent, successful artist I'd become. But he stopped making comments about assisted living facilities and financial management. He stopped treating me as a problem to be solved and started treating me as a person whose choices he might not understand but had learned to respect. The holidays that year were different too. Instead of hosting an elaborate dinner that exhausted me financially and physically, I invited Tommy's family to join me at a small restaurant I discovered near Lincoln Center. We shared a meal that no one person had spent days preparing, opened modest gifts that reflected genuine thought rather than expensive guilt management, and spent the evening looking at art books Tommy had requested for Christmas. "Grandma Eleanor," Tommy said as we were walking home through the December streets, his new sketchbook tucked under his arm and his eyes bright with contentment. "This was the best Christmas ever." "Why is that, sweetheart?" "Because everyone was just being themselves. Nobody was trying too hard to make everything perfect." Nobody was trying too hard to make everything perfect. Another profound observation from my wise young grandson, who had learned through art that authenticity was more valuable than performance, that genuine connection mattered more than elaborate presentation. As we walked through Central Park, past the Alice in Wonderland statue where he'd celebrated his 9th birthday, Tommy slipped his hand into mine. "I'm glad you're my grandmother," he said simply. "I'm glad you're my grandson," I replied, meaning it with every fiber of my being. Even when everything got complicated with Mom and Dad? Especially then. Sometimes the most important relationships are the ones that survive complicated times. He squeezed my hand, this child who had become my bridge back to family connection, my reminder that love could exist without exploitation, that teaching could be pure gift rather than obligation disguised as generosity. Looking back now, almost 2 years after that cold evening when my son threw my bags into the street, I see the woman I was then as someone I barely recognize. She lived in fear of disappointing people who were systematically disappointing her. She equated love with financial sacrifice and self-denial with virtue. She had forgotten that respect must be mutual to be meaningful, that healthy relationships require boundaries, that it's impossible to buy genuine affection no matter how much you're willing to spend. That woman had to die before I could be born. Not literally, of course, but completely. Her patterns of thinking, her assumptions about what she owed other people and what she deserved for herself, her willingness to accept crumbs and call them feasts. All of that had to be released before I could discover who I was, when I wasn't trying to be what everyone else needed me to be. The rebirth wasn't instant or easy. It required learning to tolerate other people's disapproval, to sit with the discomfort of being misunderstood, to trust my own judgment even when it contradicted the opinions of people I'd been trying to please for decades. It required developing new relationships with people who saw me clearly and liked what they saw, rather than people who saw me as useful and appreciated what I provided. Most difficult of all, it required accepting that I couldn't love Michael and Jennifer into treating me well, couldn't sacrifice enough to earn their genuine care, couldn't give enough to make them see me as anything other than a resource to be managed rather than a person to be cherished. But that acceptance, painful as it was, created space for authentic love to grow. Tommy and I have a relationship now that exists independent of his parents' financial needs or emotional manipulations. We connect through art, through conversation, through genuine mutual affection that asks nothing more of each other than presence and attention. I have friendships with people who value my thoughts, my creativity, my company for its own sake. I have work that fulfills me and provides income based on my skills rather than my willingness to deplete myself. I have a home that reflects my tastes, my needs, my vision of what comfort should look like. Most importantly, I have myself back. The woman who dreamed of painting and poetry, who saw beauty in ordinary things, and believed that creativity was essential rather than frivolous. She'd been buried under decades of other people's needs, but she wasn't dead, just sleeping, waiting for permission to emerge. The permission, I learned, was mine to give. No one else could grant it, and no one else's approval was required. I just had to stop waiting for someone else to tell me I mattered and start acting like someone who believed in her own worth. This spring, I'm planning my second solo art show, this one at a more established gallery that represents professional artists rather than displaying community work. I'm also considering teaching a regular class for seniors who want to explore creativity in their later years. People like me who set aside their artistic dreams for practical responsibilities and are now ready to reclaim them. Tommy will be 10 next month, and he's already planning the painting he wants to create for his birthday gift to me. He calls my studio every few days to share ideas, to ask technical questions, to tell me about art he's seen in books or museums that reminds him of something we've discussed. But perhaps the most meaningful change is this. I no longer wake up wondering who might need something from me today. Instead, I wake up wondering what I might create, what I might discover, what small or large adventure the day might hold. I am finally living my own life instead of serving everyone else's needs. And that life, it turns out, is more beautiful than I ever imagined possible. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family, reduced to what you could provide rather than valued for who you are? Have you ever looked around and wondered when love became so expensive, when being needed became more important than being cherished? If any of this sounds familiar, I want you to know something. It's not too late. No matter how long you've been accepting less than you deserve, no matter how many people have convinced you that your worth is measured by your usefulness, no matter how scared you are of being alone, it's not too late to remember that you matter for who you are, not what you give. Like this video if my story touched something in you. Subscribe if you want to hear more about the journey from invisible to essential, from taken for granted to truly valued. Share it if you know someone who needs to remember that they deserve better than emotional scraps and financial exploitation disguised as family love. Your story doesn't have to end with other people's needs. It can begin with your own dreams, your own worth, your own courage to say no to what diminishes you, and yes to what helps you flourish. Because you're never too old to become who you were meant to be. And the world needs exactly who you are, not who everyone else wants you to pretend to be. Thank you for listening to my heart. Thank you for helping me keep it open.